What happens when the person you trust most betrays you, leaving you with nothing? Meet Mary, whose world was turned upside down by the betrayal of her uncle, the man who was like a second father to her. Mary's childhood could have been a storybook tale. She grew up in a cozy, picture-perfect home with parents who loved each other and worked hard to provide a warm, happy life for their children. Her father, an engineer, would leave for work each day with a smile, and her mother, a stay-at-home parent, filled the house with love and delicious meals. It was a life filled with laughter, weekend trips, and a sense of security. Among the happiest memories of those early years was Uncle James. He was the one who took her to the park when her father was too busy, the one who made her laugh with silly jokes and stories. He wasn't just an uncle, he was like a second father. Mary admired him deeply and saw him as a role model, even dreaming of one day being as successful as he was. His visits were always a highlight of her week, and he always had some kind of adventure planned, whether it was a road trip or simply sitting around and chatting. To Mary, family was everything, and Uncle James embodied that sense of unity and support. Her world, as she knew it, was one of love and stability. Nothing in her young mind could prepare her for the storm that would come, the storm that would tear her world apart and change her perception of trust and family forever. But as time passed, something began to shift. A subtle unease crept into the air, though Mary couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was at first. The once joyful moments spent with her uncle started to feel different. It was as though there was an undercurrent of tension building beneath the surface, and yet she pushed those feelings aside, dismissing them as fleeting doubts. Little did she know that the idyllic world she had cherished was on the brink of collapse. The man who had been the cornerstone of her childhood was about to shatter everything. And all it would take was one terrible decision, one act of betrayal, that would send shockwaves through their entire family. Uncle James was the kind of man who could captivate anyone with his charm and confidence. He wasn't just any family member. He was the one who always seemed to have the right answers, the one everyone looked to for guidance. To Mary's parents, James was more than just a brother-in-law. He was a partner in life. He had a natural ability to make others believe in him, in his plans, and in his vision for their future. James was successful in his own right, running a real estate business with what appeared to be an impressive portfolio. His business acumen and smooth talking made him a respected figure in the family, someone they could trust. He was always offering advice, suggesting ways to invest, and promising to help their family grow financially. In his eyes, they were all part of something bigger, something that would secure their futures. For Mary, Uncle James was an idol. He seemed to have everything figured out. He was the go-to guy when they needed help with anything, whether it was fixing something around the house or offering advice on how to handle tough situations. He made her feel like everything was possible. When he spoke of future plans, it felt as though they were part of a special team, destined for greatness. The family was united, and James was at the center of it all. But as time went on, there were hints that James might not be as flawless as he seemed. There were murmurs about his business dealings, whispers of risky investments and financial troubles. But they were easy to ignore, especially when he could make everything sound so convincing. After all, he was family. And family didn't let each other down, did they? Mary's parents had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. They trusted James implicitly. His advice, his guidance, his promises, they all felt genuine. So when he presented them with the opportunity to buy the land, they took it without hesitation. It was James's idea, and it seemed like a golden opportunity, a chance to secure their future. They didn't realize it then, but this decision would be the turning point, the moment everything changed. James wasn't just a member of their family, he was their protector, their mentor, and, in many ways, the one they depended on most. But little did they know, the man they trusted more than anyone else was about to betray them in the most devastating way imaginable. It all started with a conversation that felt like a new beginning for Mary's family. Uncle James, ever the persuasive figure, approached her parents with an offer. He told them about a piece of land that was available for sale, a plot of land just outside the city, in a growing area. His pitch was flawless. He described the land as an incredible investment opportunity, one that would set them up for the future and provide a sense of security for Mary and her siblings. According to James, the area was developing quickly, and soon the land would be worth far more than they paid for it. For Mary's parents, it sounded like a dream come true. They had been thinking about ways to invest their savings, to secure their family's financial future, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. James assured them that it was a win-win situation. He even made the deal sound like it was a favor to the family, a chance to invest in something they could all benefit from. To Mary's father, who was always careful with money, it was a decision that seemed to make sense. He trusted James, trusted his experience, and believed that this would be a secure investment for his family. The terms of the deal were seemingly straightforward. James made it clear that he would sell the land to them at a price far below market value, promising that they would be able to resell it or develop it as they saw fit. At the time, it all seemed perfectly legitimate. After all, James had always been a reliable figure in their lives. What could go wrong? For Mary's mother, who had always been more cautious, there was a sense of doubt. But she trusted her husband's judgment and, more importantly, James's expertise. She pushed her reservations aside, believing that if anyone could make it work, it was James. Plus, it wasn't just a business deal. It was family. It felt like the right thing to do. And so, Mary's parents agreed to buy the land. They signed the papers without a second thought, believing it would be a step toward securing their financial future. Little did they know that this decision would lead them down a path of financial ruin and emotional devastation. What seemed like a gesture of trust and family loyalty was, in reality, the beginning of their greatest betrayal. It wasn't long after the purchase that cracks in Uncle James's perfect image started to appear. At first, the warning signs were subtle: small delays in paperwork, odd excuses when Mary's parents tried to reach him, and an increasing number of phone calls that went unanswered. Then, one fateful day, everything came crashing down. The family was blindsided when they received a letter in the mail from the bank. The foreclosure notice was clear and final. Mary's family's land was no longer theirs. The land they had bought, the land they had trusted Uncle James to manage, was being seized by the bank. It turned out that James had mortgaged the property to the hilt long before offering it to Mary's parents. What they thought was a simple, safe investment had been a house of cards, built on lies and deception. The shock of it all was overwhelming. James had been hiding his financial instability for years. While he had been charming Mary's family with his talk of future wealth and security, he had been sinking deeper into debt. The land was never his to sell, and now, not only had he lost it to the bank, but he had also drained any chance of recovery for Mary's family. When Mary's father confronted James, the truth came out. James had been living a lie, pretending to be successful while drowning in financial ruin. The bankruptcy was declared, and James vanished. He had made a quick exit, leaving behind nothing but broken promises and a devastated family. For Mary's parents, the betrayal was unfathomable. How could the man they had trusted most do this to them? The land they thought would secure their future had been a mirage, a cruel illusion that turned to dust. The emotional devastation hit them harder than the financial loss. The trust they had placed in James, the hopes and dreams they had built around this investment, were shattered. But worse was the realization that James had never cared for them in the way they had cared for him. To him, they were nothing more than pawns in his selfish game. As Mary's family grappled with the fallout, the full extent of their loss began to sink in. The land wasn't just a financial asset, it was the embodiment of their dreams for the future, their plan to leave something lasting for their children. Now, All of it was gone, and in its place was nothing but a hollow sense of betrayal and despair. The day the foreclosure signs were posted on the land was a moment that Mary's family would never forget. It wasn't just a legal notification, it felt like a cruel punch to the gut. The entire family gathered at the land, staring at the signs that now adorned the property, signaling its loss. Mary's father stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the extent of what had just happened. It was as though the ground beneath him had shifted, and he was left standing in the rubble of his own dreams. For Mary, it felt like a loss of innocence. This land had represented so much: security, a future, and the hope that they would one day build something lasting. To her, it wasn't just a financial transaction. It was the symbol of a future they had worked so hard to build. Now, that future had crumbled before her eyes. The home they had dreamed of was no longer a possibility. The plans for expansion, the hope of providing a better life for her siblings, all of it was gone in an instant. Her mother, who had always been the calm, grounding force in the family, was beside herself. She kept asking how this could have happened. "How could we have been so foolish?" she cried, looking at her husband. "We trusted him. We trusted James." Her mother's voice was filled with a mix of disbelief and regret. For Mary's father, the feeling of betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss. His brother-in-law, someone he had trusted, someone he had looked up to, had led them into this mess. And now, their dreams were shattered. But the hardest part wasn't just losing the land. It was the loss of their sense of security, the feeling that their future had been taken from them. They had worked hard, sacrificed, and believed in something that wasn't real. And now, they had nothing. The foreclosure was the moment when reality hit them. The dream was gone, and they were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The land, once a symbol of hope and progress, had become a harsh reminder of the betrayal. And for Mary's family, this wasn't just a financial crisis. It was an emotional wound that would take years to heal. The emotional toll of the betrayal hit Mary's family harder than the loss of the land itself. The foreclosure was just the beginning of a much deeper crisis that tore through their household. It wasn't just the financial devastation that rocked them, it was the trust they had placed in Uncle James, and the realization that he had exploited their love and loyalty for his own gain. This betrayal wasn't just about money, it was about their entire world being upended. Mary's father, once a proud and steady man, descended into a spiral of despair. The weight of the betrayal was too much for him to bear. He started drinking more, and as the days passed, he grew distant, sinking deeper into alcohol dependency. His once bright outlook on life vanished, replaced by a sadness that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Mary's mother tried to hold the family together, but she too was crushed by the loss of not only the land, but also the man she had once known so well. The bitterness between Mary's parents grew. Her father became irritable and withdrawn, no longer the man who could be counted on to make decisions with confidence. He blamed himself, and his guilt turned to anger. Anger at James, but also at himself. He had trusted his brother-in-law, had believed in him when everyone else had doubts. Now, all he could do was drown his sorrow in alcohol, pushing away the people who cared for him the most. For Mary, the emotional fallout was equally devastating. She couldn't help but feel a deep sense of betrayal, not just from James, but from the entire situation. How could someone who had been so much a part of their lives turn out to be so dishonest? How could someone she had admired and trusted break her family apart in such a heartless way? Her memories of Uncle James, once filled with affection and admiration, became tainted with resentment and bitterness. The uncle she had once seen as a protector had turned into a villain in her eyes. The idealized version of him that she had carried with her all her life was gone, replaced by the stark reality of who he truly was. As Mary watched her family unravel, she began to realize that the true cost of James's betrayal wasn't just the land. It was the loss of their happiness, their unity, and their peace of mind. It wasn't just a financial loss. It was the destruction of everything her family had worked for, all because one man had made a choice to deceive them. Her father's decline was the hardest thing to watch. The man who had once been strong, dependable, and the backbone of their family was now a shadow of his former self. His addiction to alcohol not only ruined his health, but also drove a wedge between him and his wife. The once happy, stable home had turned into a place filled with tension, anger, and sadness. It felt as though the light had been dimmed forever. For years, Uncle James had been a fixture in Mary's family's life. He was the one who could always be counted on for advice, the uncle who had a wealth of experience and a way with words. He was the one who made everything seem easy, who always had a plan, and who seemed to have the answers when things got tough. For Mary, he was a kind of hero, a protector of sorts in the family, someone who was always there when they needed him. But when the truth of the situation came to light, everything changed. The man who had been a constant presence in their lives was suddenly revealed to be someone they barely recognized. Uncle James wasn't the trustworthy family member they had all relied on. He was a man with a hidden agenda, driven by greed and deceit. The land he had sold them wasn't an opportunity, it was a trap, and he had set it knowing full well the financial ruin it would bring. For Mary's parents, the shift from trust to betrayal was a painful one. They couldn't reconcile the man they thought they knew with the person who had orchestrated their destruction. How could they have been so blind? How could they have missed the signs that James was struggling with his own financial instability? They had trusted him, believed in his promises, and now they were left with nothing but the shattered remnants of their faith. As the anger grew, so did the bitterness. The once fond memories of holidays spent together, of family gatherings and shared laughter, were now clouded by the overwhelming sense of betrayal. Mary could no longer think of her uncle without feeling a knot of resentment in her stomach. The memories that once made her smile now filled her with disgust. It was as though the person she had once adored had never existed. In his place was a man who had only used his family to cover up his own failures. For Mary's parents, the hardest part was understanding how they had been so trusting, so willing to believe that James had their best interests at heart. The realization that he had betrayed them for his own gain made everything they had shared with him feel hollow. The family dinners, the stories, the good times, they were all tainted by the knowledge that James had been lying to them the entire time. And the hardest pill to swallow was that Uncle James had left, disappearing without a trace, leaving his family behind to deal with the wreckage. He didn't offer an apology, didn't try to make things right. He simply vanished, leaving his lies and deceit in his wake. For Mary, it was the ultimate act of cowardice. The man who had been so important to their lives was now nothing more than a distant memory, one that she wished she could erase from her mind. As the realization of the betrayal set in, the family's emotional turmoil began to spiral out of control. For Mary's father, the blow to his pride and his sense of security was too much to bear. He had always prided himself on being the provider, the protector of his family, and the man who could fix any problem. But now, in the face of James's deceit and the loss of the land, he felt helpless. The dream he had for his family's future was gone, and with it, his sense of self-worth. In the wake of this devastation, Mary's father turned to alcohol as a way to cope with the pain. What started as an occasional drink to numb the ache quickly spiraled into a full-blown addiction. He became distant, irritable, and angry at everyone around him. His wife, Mary's mother, watched helplessly as the man she had once known transformed into someone unrecognizable. The man who had been her rock was now a shell of himself, lost in a haze of alcohol and despair. The once vibrant and loving household began to deteriorate. The laughter and joy that had filled their home were replaced by silence and tension. Mary's mother tried to hold things together, but her own emotional pain, combined with the weight of her husband's addiction, made it nearly impossible to keep the family from falling apart. Every day was a struggle, with Mary and her siblings caught in the middle of a battle that felt like it would never end. For Mary, the hardest part was watching her father lose himself. She had always seen him as a strong, dependable figure, someone who would always have the answers. Now she was forced to watch as he succumbed to the same despair that had brought their family to its knees. The loss of the land was devastating, but the emotional toll it took on her father was even worse. Mary could no longer look at him without seeing the pain and disappointment etched into his face. The man who had once been the foundation of their family was now a broken figure, lost to the grip of alcohol. As the months passed, the family dynamics shifted. Mary's father became more isolated, and her mother became more withdrawn. They were both too consumed by their own emotional battles to provide the support they once had for their children. Mary, who had once looked to her parents for guidance, now found herself trying to be the strong one, trying to hold her family together when all she wanted to do was fall apart. It was clear that the effects of James's betrayal had cut deeper than just the financial loss. It had torn at the very fabric of their family, leaving scars that would never fully heal. The emotional damage was far more lasting than the loss of the land, and it would take years for Mary and her family to come to terms with what had happened. As time passed, the weight of Uncle James's betrayal didn't simply fade into the background. It lingered, gnawing at the edges of Mary's family's existence. But amidst the heartache, something began to change. The rawness of the initial shock began to subside, and in its place, a quiet realization started to emerge. They had to move on, despite everything. Mary's father, though still struggling with alcoholism, slowly started to acknowledge the toll his addiction had taken on his family. It wasn't an easy process. Every attempt to quit was met with resistance, and each relapse felt like a further step away from the man he used to be. But small moments of clarity began to emerge. There were nights when Mary's father would sit at the kitchen table, his hands trembling as he admitted how deeply ashamed he felt of what had happened to them. These brief moments of vulnerability were painful, but they offered a glimmer of hope. He was starting to realize that his family still needed him, and if he could somehow break free from the chains of alcohol, maybe there was a chance for them to rebuild. Mary and her mother began to rebuild their relationship too, though it wasn't without its challenges. They had both been so consumed by their own emotional struggles that they had drifted apart. But as the years passed, Mary's mother started to regain her strength. She enrolled in counseling to cope with the grief of losing both her dreams for the future and the husband she had once known. Slowly but surely, she found a way to reclaim her sense of self. For Mary, the process of healing was more internal. She spent years trying to come to terms with the betrayal, not just by Uncle James, but by the world itself. She was no longer the carefree child who had trusted her family members without question. Her innocence had been stolen by the harsh realities of life, but she refused to let bitterness define her future. Over time, she learned to embrace forgiveness, not for James, but for herself. She had to let go of the anger and resentment that had consumed her for so long. It wasn't easy, but with every passing year, the weight on her chest began to lift. Though the family had lost their home, their dreams, and the trust of someone they had loved, they didn't lose each other. They found new ways to come together, supporting one another in their own ways. It wasn't a quick fix, and it certainly wasn't easy, but there was healing, slow, steady, and painful, on the horizon. And while they could never undo the damage that had been done, they realized that they still had the power to move forward. The road ahead wasn't clear, but with each other's help they could navigate it. and maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to rebuild the life that had once seemed so perfect. Uncle James never came back. After his bankruptcy declaration and the chaos that followed, he simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but a broken family and a trail of unanswered questions. For months, Mary's family held on to a faint hope that he would return to explain himself, to apologize, to somehow make amends. But that never happened. Instead, he disappeared, as if the whole ordeal had never happened. His absence, however, became a critical part of the healing process for Mary and her family. At first, the absence was a painful reminder of everything they had lost. They spent nights wondering what James was doing, where he was, and why he had betrayed them so completely. There was no closure, no apology, and no chance for resolution. His leaving felt like the final slap in the face, a silent, cowardly acknowledgement of the damage he had caused and his unwillingness to face the consequences. But over time, Mary came to realize that perhaps his absence was the closure they needed. It wasn't the closure they had wanted, but it was the closure they deserved. James's refusal to face them, his inability to come to terms with the harm he had caused, left no room for excuses. It became clear that he would never be the person they had once hoped he could be. And while his disappearance didn't take away the pain, it did allow Mary's family to finally start the process of truly letting go. Mary's family came to understand that, in the end, the most important thing was not what James had done to them, but how they chose to respond. They could continue to live in the shadow of his betrayal, waiting for an apology that would never come, or they could face the reality of the situation and choose to move forward with their lives. Slowly, they began to do just that. For Mary's father, it meant continuing his battle with alcoholism, finding the strength to reclaim his life from the grip of addiction. For Mary's mother, it meant finally finding peace, knowing that the man she had loved and trusted was not the person she thought he was. And for Mary, it meant embracing her own growth, learning to forgive, not for James, but for her own peace of mind. In the end, James's disappearance gave Mary's family the final piece of the puzzle. They no longer needed closure from him. They had already found it within themselves. And with that, they could finally begin to rebuild their lives. Thank you for reading. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support means the world.